That's leverage for Putin, and it's leverage to frankly stay away from the negotiating table if Russia and the Kremlin believes that it can outlast U.S. support for Ukraine, and just continue to grind down a smaller Ukraine.
Today I'm joined by Riley McCabe, an Associate Fellow of the Warfare, Irregular Threats and Terrorism Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, I was happy to be here.
The US has announced a reduction of military aid to Ukraine following a review of its military stockpiles. Let's get straight into it. What are the details of this reduction of support?
Sure. So based on the latest reporting, what we're seeing is the U.S. plans to cut just a few specific deliveries of military equipment to Ukraine that it had said it was going to deliver. That includes, again, just based on some of the reporting, about 30 Patriot air defense missiles. Those are air defense systems. They're the missiles that are actually fired by Patriot systems that are already in Ukraine. We've also seen that they plan to pause about 8,000 or so, the delivery of 8,000 or so 155 millimeter artillery shells. We've also seen 250 or so Gimler missiles are paused. Those are rocket precision artillery missiles, as well as about 140 Hellfire missiles, which are air-to-surface missiles fired by fighter jets.
And roughly how long a time frame would that sort of that amount of ammunition be used up on the battlefield?
Yeah, it's a great question because it helps kind of put a scope on what this pause really means. It's actually a fairly limited pause in the numbers and the quantities we're talking about. The Patriot air defense system or missiles, and we can talk about this, is frankly, I think, going to be the most impactful pause. When we look at the 8,000 or so artillery shells that are no longer going to be delivered under this pause, that's actually a relatively small number. The U.S. has given over 3 million artillery shells over the course of this war. Ukraine is reportedly expending thousands per day along its extended front line. So while it will certainly hurt Ukraine to lose some of this military equipment, to not get it delivered, we're talking about rather small quantities. Although the Patriot air defense systems, which are important for defending not just along the front line but also civilian targets throughout the country, those could be more damaging.
So you touched a little bit on it there, but what would be the impact of this pause, this reduction of support?
Yeah, well, I want to say that Ukraine is desperate for all the equipment it can get. So any loss, any pause in military aid is going to hurt Ukraine's battlefield performance. This is particularly bad timing for the pause in air defense systems or the pause in the delivery of air defense missiles, because Russia has shifted over the past several months towards increasingly emphasizing a strategy of punishment. We've seen that obviously Russia wants to take territory along the front lines in Ukraine, but its progress has been rather slow. And what it's doing in the past several months is it's increasingly airstriking targets throughout Ukraine, civilian and military. And that seems to indicate a shift in its strategy from one where it wants to focus its efforts along the front line and take territory, which of course it's still attempting to do, but it's also now increasingly striking targets throughout all of Ukraine in an attempt to coerce political will.
So would that potentially relieve or alleviate some pressure from the front line, especially considering there's supposed to be this new, well, not so new anymore, but summer offensive?
I think they can happen at the same time, frankly. They involve different resources. Obviously, Russia requires a lot of manpower, a lot of armor along the front line. That's tanks, armored vehicles, in order to take the territory in this grinding battle of attrition that we're seeing. It, however, can do that while also sustaining its air campaign, striking targets throughout Ukraine, including civilian targets. And that's why the loss of air defense missiles or the pausing of the delivery of air defense missiles is particularly impactful in this scenario.
So from reporting that I've seen, the Ukraine's defense ministry saw this report of reduction in support basically at the same time as the rest of us, saying that they had no official communications that there was going to be a pause. what message should we be reading into this? Is this just a logistical issue on the side of America, or is there some message you're reading?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think how Ukraine views this, how Europe views this as well as a supporter of Ukraine, is really important because, frankly, this isn't new. This isn't the this shouldn't really come as a large surprise. We've been getting signals from the Trump administration that it intends to reduce its support of Ukraine for several months. In just earlier this month, Hegseth testified on Capitol Hill regarding the FY fiscal year 2026 a budget, saying that there will be cuts to support for Ukraine. Hegseth, Secretary of Defense Hegseth, also skipped the Ukraine Defense Contract Group meeting in Brussels in June, which was the first time a Secretary of Defense from the United States had skipped that meeting. There was obviously the pause in March of aid and intelligence support for Ukraine after Zelensky and Trump's very fiery meeting in the Oval Office. We've already seen, frankly, before this, that some promised systems to Ukraine have been diverted elsewhere, and no new aid packages have been approved during Trump's second term. So that's all to say, this may come as a surprise to the Ukrainians and the Europeans as well, but it shouldn't. It really shouldn't, because the Trump administration has long been signaling its intent in this regard.
So, how do you think this could be something of the start of the story of the reduction of support, or is this just the first instance that's a logistical thing given the US stockpiles?
Yeah, I think it's hard to speculate what this administration will do. I think if we take them at their word, we can see a couple different paths that this goes, because they've given various reasons for reductions in support. The most recent one that you alluded to is concern over U.S. stockpiles. That's a legitimate concern about U.S. readiness. That same concern actually dictated some Biden era reductions in aid. So, for example, at the start of the war, the U.S. gave Ukraine lots of javelins. Those are anti-tank missiles. But we expended so many in our aid to Ukraine that our own stockpiles were depleted, and we actually had to slow and then eventually stop giving Ukraine javelins. So there are legitimate concerns about readiness. It's hard to know what's left in those stockpiles from the outside, but this points towards potential other reasons that the administration has also signaled. So they clearly want Europe to play a bigger role in supporting Ukraine. There are also domestic political incentives that, Trump's base here in the United States wants less involvement in conflicts overseas. We saw that rift emerge in the Republican Party over the strikes in Iran. So it depends, frankly, the future of what future cuts could occur will kind of depend on which logic we take the administration's word for. If it's concerns over U.S. stockpiles, then aid of certain types of equipment should continue just fine, because we have we have plenty in our stockpiles of certain types of equipment and less in others. If it's that the administration wants Europe to play a larger role, or it wants to be less involved in conflicts overseas, then that would indicate that these cuts are potentially just the beginning.
To my understanding, the US support to Ukraine accounts for about 20 or 30, depending on who you ask, of the military support to Ukraine. And also, I believe it survived, 9 months or so in 2024 without support from the US, as it was gridlocked in Congress. How long could Ukraine last if US support was completely cut off?
Yeah, well, it's that last part that really matters. The scope of the cutoff here will really matter. If all U.S. support is cut off, that obviously is a somewhat dire situation for Ukraine. What it really does is it puts the ball in Europe's court. Can Europe step up to fill some of the manufacturing and delivery requirements that the U.S. has obviously bared the primary burden of throughout the war? It also beckons a larger question of what a total cutoff means, because the U.S. can stop giving military assistance to Ukraine and stop delivering military equipment. What it could do, and go one step further, is it could reach across the Atlantic and say, you also cannot deliver from Europe U.S. manufactured equipment, and that would obviously make the situation far worse than just a U.S. cutoff. What we've also seen is the critical role that U.S. intelligence has played in enabling Ukrainian operations. So whether a cutoff encompasses that, as well as our economic support, our humanitarian support, a complete cutoff could look like a bunch of different things, frankly, and how degrading it is to the Ukrainian performance on the battlefield will depend on what is cut.
So if we were to assume that the intelligence sharing were to stay, but essentially the arms deliveries that have been paused now was just a blanket stop, what sort of capability would Ukraine have if it was fighting on 4/5 or 2/3 of its capability in terms of, I guess, ammunition?
Yeah, well, it's hard to speculate whether or not that would degrade Ukraine's ability so much so that Russia could generate a breakthrough in the front lines. War is, hard to predict. Battlefield performance is hard to predict. The Ukrainians clearly have a strong will to fight, so I don't think the loss of aid it might damage that will to fight, but I certainly don't think that the Ukrainians would lose their political will and that we would experience the kind of collapse politically in Ukraine. However, yes, it would hurt on the battlefield. U.S. intelligence in this scenario that you've painted would still enable Ukraine to conduct both defensive operations as well as offensive precision strikes. And frankly, how quickly Europe can fill the gap left in the scenario will dictate whether or not Ukraine has simply the munitions it needs, the artillery shells it needs to continue to punish advancing Russian forces.
I suppose how did things get to this point in terms of there being a reduction or a pause? And I suppose I'm asking in the context of Trump not barely a week ago following the NATO summit saying, we'll see if we can free up some more Patriot missile defense systems for Ukraine. It seems, as I'm sure much of the decisions have been, somewhat contradictory with action and words.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to be skeptical of this administration's motives for these cuts in aid because it has given a lot of mixed signals, and it's maybe skeptical is the wrong word. Maybe it's simply confused because we're getting, like I mentioned earlier, we're getting all different sorts of logic. The concern over U.S. stockpiles, the wanting Europe to play a larger role, domestic political incentives to reduce the U.S. roles in the world. It's also clear, frankly, that Trump doesn't like Zelensky that much on a personal basis, and he has stated several times that he wants to improve relations with Russia, and at times has made statements of admiration for Putin. So it's difficult to decipher, frankly, what the motive is in this administration. If we take them at their word that it's readiness, that's a legitimate concern. I think where people are skeptical, and rightly so, is because we're getting a bunch of different signals about what the motive may be. As you pointed out, in this administration, Trump seems to decide, and Trump's personality dictates policy. So that can certainly explain some of the swinging that we're seeing between, yes, we'll continue to support, and suddenly, no, we're actually making this one pause now.
So in the background, Keith Kellogg has accused Russia of stalling negotiations. And is Keith Kellogg talking with a bit of the power of the White House here, or is he sort of just pointing out maybe a fact that many of us already knew?
Yeah, I'm not going to speculate where power lies in this White House, frankly. I think, your guess is as good as mine. It seems to be that Trump dictates policy largely. What I will say on peace negotiations is that pauses in aid like this one and the other signals that U.S. support for Ukraine is wavering or may not be there for the long term. That's leverage for Putin, and it's leverage to, frankly, stay away from the negotiating table if Russia and the Kremlin believes that it can outlast U.S. support for Ukraine and just continue to grind down a smaller Ukraine.
And so, what's your analysis of that situation? Is Putin more likely to outlast Trump, or Trump outlast Putin?
I'd like to think that the United States will continue to support Ukraine. I obviously the signals coming from this administration are that that support is in jeopardy. But I am not yet. I have not yet turned the corner as a total skeptic that we are going to abandon Ukraine. I think that the strategic value of supporting Ukraine still remains. Russia is not our friend. What we can do to degrade Russia without losing U.S. troops is excellent. We benefit from stable food and energy markets. So we want Ukraine to succeed in this fight. We benefit from aid to Ukraine. U.S. manufacturing, defense manufacturing benefits directly. Most U.S. aid to Ukraine is actually money spent here at home. And of course, the moral and ethical motives of defending democracy and the principle of sovereignty. So I'd like to think that those motivations remain and persist and will be seen by this administration. So I'm hopeful that despite this pause, we will continue to have U.S. support for Ukraine, though clearly it is in jeopardy.
Riley McCabe, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.